The Tau believed they were invisible to the warp. They were wrong, and something in the darkness between stars had finally noticed them. Deep within a research facility on Daleth Sept, an Earth-cased engineer named Monat stared at something impossible. A small human figurine hung in the air, rotating slowly. The containment field was offline. Had been offline for 3 days. The object simply floated there, defying every law of physics the Tau had spent millennia perfecting. When Monat reached out to touch it, her hand passed through empty space, while her eyes insisted the figurine remained exactly where it was. She pulled her hand back and watched frost form on her fingertips in a room reading 22 degrees standard. That night, she dreamed of wings covered in eyes that wept blood the color of starlight. When she woke, she found a pattern carved into her forearm that she didn't remember making. A perfect circle bisected by 7 lines, pulsing with heat her medical scanner couldn't detect. This wasn't a malfunction. This was first contact with something the Tau had never believed existed. And across 4 different septs, 15 other facilities were reporting the exact same impossible phenomena. The Tau Empire was built on certainty. For thousands of years, they had expanded across the stars using science, reason, and the unifying philosophy of the greater good. They studied alien technologies, perfected warfare through calculated doctrine, and negotiated treaties with mathematical precision. Every problem had a solution. Every mystery would eventually yield to rational inquiry. They looked at species like humanity, with their superstitious talk of gods and daemons and psychic powers, and saw primitives clinging to explanations for phenomena they simply hadn't learned to measure yet. The Tau had no Psykers. Their connection to what humans called the warp was so minimal that it barely registered. This had always been their shield, their protection against horrors that consumed other civilizations. But shields can become cages, and ignorance is only armor until the day it becomes a blindfold. The reports started arriving at the Ethereal Council with disturbing frequency. Objects moving without power sources, sensors returning contradictory data that suggested reality itself was malfunctioning. Engineers across multiple septs, experiencing identical dreams that left physical marks on their bodies. 3 researchers died under circumstances that medical experts couldn't explain. Their bodies simply stopped functioning despite showing no signs of disease or injury. One was found in her laboratory with every drop of blood transformed into a crystalline substance that sang when touched, producing sounds that caused auditory hallucinations in anyone who heard them. Monat filed her report through proper channels, documenting the rotating figurine and the mark on her arm with scientific precision. 6 days later, a response arrived that violated every principle of transparent scientific inquiry the Tau held sacred. Cease all research immediately. Transfer the object to a specially designated containment team. Submit to full medical and psychological evaluation. No explanation was provided. Her supervisor, a veteran named Rezan who had served through the Third Sphere expansion, read the message and looked at Monat with something she had never seen in a Tau's eyes before. Pure, unfiltered fear. What the Tau didn't know, what they couldn't know without the framework to understand it, was that the Immaterium was noticing them. For millennia, they had existed as a species almost invisible to the warp, their souls producing such faint psychic presence that demons passed them by like predators ignoring insects too small to provide sustenance. But the Tau had expanded too far, absorbed too many psychically active species into their empire. Humans, Kroot, Vespid, all burning brightly in the Immaterium, creating a net of lights that surrounded Tau space and drew the attention of things that swam in deeper, darker waters. The Great Rift had torn reality open, turning the warp's whisper into a scream, and even the Tau's dim souls were beginning to catch echoes of that terrible sound. Then came the incident at Tros Station. On a dead world designated Tros, a research team had discovered ruins from a civilization that had been extinct for millennia. The planet's surface was scorched glass, its cities vitrified by weapons that had burned the crust down to bedrock. But deep underground, sealed chambers had survived. The Tau excavation team found what their xenoarchaeologists classified as a temple. The walls were covered in frescoes depicting beings that shifted between different forms depending on the viewing angle. At the center stood a well, a shaft descending into darkness that their sensors couldn't penetrate. They sent drones down to map it. None returned. The machines simply ceased, exist at exactly 100 meters depth, their signals terminating without indication of impact or system failure. A fire-cased veteran turned researcher named Vey decided to investigate personally. He rigged a rappelling system and descended into the well while his team monitored from above. At 90 meters, his voice came through the Vox clear and calm. At 98 meters, he said something that changed everything. "I can hear singing." His team asked him to clarify. Vey replied that it wasn't sound in the traditional sense, but something he felt in his bones, a resonance that carried meaning without language. Then his voice changed. The words remained Tau, recognizable, but something in the cadence twisted until his team leader ordered immediate emergency extraction. They pulled him up hand over hand, fighting resistance that their equipment swore didn't exist. When they finally hauled Vey over the well's lip, they found a warrior who had descended into darkness and brought something back with him. Vey's eyes had changed color. Not different pigmentation, but reflecting light at wavelengths Tau eyes shouldn't perceive, creating colors that observers' brains couldn't properly process. He was smiling, which was itself unusual for a fire-caste warrior raised on stoicism. He told his team that he finally understood. The voices in the well had shown him truth. The galaxy wasn't governed by laws of physics, but by intelligences vast and terrible that shaped reality according to incomprehensible desires. The Tau Empire was an insect on the back of a leviathan, mistaking the beast's stillness for solid ground. When his team tried to sedate him, Vey raised his hand, and the air between his palm and the nearest researcher solidified. Empty space became substance, became a barrier that instruments detected as existing while simultaneously reading as complete vacuum. The barrier remained for 3 seconds, then dissipated. Vey collapsed into unconsciousness that would last 4 days. The emergency transmission from Teros Station reached the Ethereal Council, with full medical scans showing something that should have been impossible. Vey's brain was functioning in ways no Tau's ever had. Regions of neural tissue dormant his entire life now blazed with activity, forming new connections that suggested either aggressive tumor or something so far outside medical understanding that they lacked words to describe it. His genetic code showed mutations, changes appearing at fundamental levels. Whatever Vey had encountered in that well had rewritten him, transforming a rational Tau warrior into something that touched the Immaterium. The Tau had discovered Psykers, or more accurately, something in the warp had discovered the Tau and decided to give them the gift of vision, whether they wanted it or not. The ethereal caste convened in emergency session. These meetings were normally exercises in careful consensus, every voice heard before decisions emerged through patient deliberation. This council lasted less than 3 hours before devolving into what the Tau had no framework to process, an argument born of existential terror. A junior ethereal named Raylon stood before the assembly and described how he had begun hearing voices 3 cycles ago. They spoke in dead languages, promising knowledge and power, and when he tried to meditate them away using techniques that had served his entire life, they had simply laughed. The sound was glass breaking inside his skull. He had been documenting these experiences with scientific rigor, treating his deterioration as a phenomenon to be studied. His report included sketches of symbols that made other ethereals physically recoil when displayed. The Earth-caste's leading scientists provided context using anatomy and genetics, but their explanations only confirmed the worst fears. The Tau genome was changing. Mutations were appearing simultaneously across populations with no contact, coordinated spontaneous changes that violated every principle of evolutionary science. Something was rewriting Tau biology according to rules that defied comprehension. The Firecast reported combat drops where warriors suddenly ceased, screaming words the Vox couldn't translate. 3 soldiers had felt something vast and intelligent pressing against their minds, trying to pour itself into spaces where thoughts should be. In the moment before losing consciousness, They understood with absolute clarity that their entire civilization was blind. The debate raged for days. How does a civilization built on empiricism address phenomena that defy measurement? How does reason respond when reason proves insufficient? Some argued for immediate suppression of all psychic development. Others claimed that was impossible. The mutations were spreading regardless of preferences, and individuals would manifest abilities whether prepared or not. Better to understand and control than face random manifestations without framework for managing them. Finally, Anva himself spoke, the oldest ethereal whose wisdom had guided the empire through its greatest trials. He told them a story few had heard, from before the Tao's unification. The ethereals had emerged during those dark times with abilities that seemed almost miraculous, bringing unity through force of will that early texts described as the voices that whispered and the touch that calmed the savage mind. These phrases had always been interpreted as metaphor. Anva suggested that perhaps the interpretation had been too comfortable. Perhaps the ethereals themselves were proof that the Tao had never been quite as immune to the warp as they believed. The decision that emerged was characteristically Tao, a compromise between boldness and caution. They would pursue defensive psychic development, focused not on creating powerful psychers, but on understanding phenomena well enough to defend against them. A new division was established, Koror Talka, understanding the immeasurable. It would study, document, and eventually control the psychic awakenings spreading through the empire. The Tao would approach even the impossible with rational methodology. They would face the warp as they had faced every challenge, through science, unity, and faith that sufficient preparation could mitigate any danger. That confidence would be tested sooner than anyone expected. The screening programs began immediately, identifying Tao with emerging psychic potential before manifestation could turn catastrophic. In the first 6 months, 247 Tao across all septs showed some degree of sensitivity. Most were minimal. 37 showed stronger potential. 3 registered at levels that would have warranted immediate execution in the Imperium. These became the alpha subjects, the focus of intensive study under protocols designed with human and Aeldari advice. Alpha 1 was Sael, a fire-cased warrior who had stopped a live pulse round mid-flight during training. She raised her hand instinctively, and the projectile froze in the air for 2 full seconds before clattering to the ground. She reported feeling something inside her reach out and grasp the round, though not with hands but with a part of herself she'd never known existed. Alpha 2 was Terran, an Earth-caste engineer who lost 4 hours and woke surrounded by schematics she didn't remember creating. The designs were for devices that violated physics, configurations her conscious mind insisted were impossible, but that she understood on intuitive levels. She described dreams of vast mechanical complexes where thought and matter merged, where something had placed knowledge directly into her mind. Alpha 3 was Shais, a water-cased diplomat who suddenly announced that a human governor was planning betrayal. She provided specific details she claimed came from reading his mind during conversation. A fire-cased raid confirmed everything, capturing evidence that matched her telepathic perceptions with perfect accuracy. The 3 alphas were brought together at a secure facility on Tau itself, a structure incorporating Imperial sanctioning infrastructure adapted with Tau innovations, force fields tuned to psychic frequencies, monitoring systems tracking neural activity and atmospheric disturbances, automated protocols ready to flood chambers with sedatives if subjects showed instability. The facility represented the Tau approach, comprehensive monitoring, redundant safety, and faith that preparation could mitigate any danger. Training combined human meditation techniques with Tao methodology. The subjects learned to perceive abilities as extensions of natural capabilities, phenomena that could be studied and refined through practice. Sael worked on telekinesis, moving progressively heavier objects with increasing precision. Terran documented visions that provided impossible knowledge. Shais refined her telepathy, learning to control when she perceived others' thoughts. All 3 showed progress that encouraged their handlers and terrified the ethereals who received reports. Then Sael demonstrated something that shouldn't have been possible. During defensive training, an instructor accidentally loaded a live round. The projectile caught Sail off guard, and in the instant before impact, something extraordinary happened. She didn't stop the round, she erased it. The projectile simply ceased to exist, its energy dispersing without explosion or heat. Sensors captured perfect detail. One moment the round existed with measurable mass and momentum, the next moment that space contained only air at ambient temperature. Sail collapsed immediately, unconscious before hitting the ground. Her demonstration of what researchers termed nullification represented something fundamentally different from documented psychic abilities. She had convinced reality that an object had never existed, pulling threads in the fabric of existence itself. When Sail woke 3 days later, she reported experiences that chilled everyone who heard them. During nullification, she had perceived the projectile as a thread in reality's fabric, and pulling that thread felt like tearing skin. The warp had noticed her action, felt her presence the way an organism feels infection. In the darkness behind her closed eyes, something vast had examined her with attention that felt like dissection without anesthesia. It hadn't been hostile, simply curious about this new form of life that could reach into the Immaterium and alter reality in ways even it found novel. The experience left her changed, able to perceive what she called the underneath, a dimension where possibilities existed before collapsing into single realities. She could see these ghostly possibilities now, overlaying what was with what might be. The vision never stopped. Even sleeping, Sail perceived the underneath churning with potential that threatened to overwhelm her conscious mind. 6 months into accelerated training, disaster struck at a facility on Viola Sept. 12 Tau Psykers were conducting group meditation designed to help them perceive and control abilities collectively. The theory was sound. Psykers working together could pool strength while supporting each other's discipline. During this session, one trainee named Vash experienced what monitors initially classified as standard meditation breakthrough. His neural activity spiked sharply. Then something changed. Vash began screaming, though his mouth didn't move, his voice projecting directly into the minds of everyone present. The other 11 trainees seized simultaneously, their minds forcibly connected to whatever Vash was experiencing. Through that connection, they all saw what he saw. Survivors described Vash opening like a door, his psyche becoming a portal through which something else could perceive the material universe. The entity that looked through him was vast beyond comprehension, its attention encompassing the entire facility with casual ease. It studied the Tau Psykers the way a xenobiologist examines newly discovered species, noting characteristics with detached intellectual curiosity. The entity communicated not with words but with understanding impressed directly onto consciousness. What it conveyed was simple and terrible. The Tau were noticed now. Their attempts to develop psychic abilities had made them visible in the Immaterium, bright sparks in comfortable darkness. Other entities would come to investigate, some curious, others predatory, and rationalism wouldn't protect them from attention they couldn't refuse. The entity showed them visions of what that attention might mean. Tau cities where geometry twisted into impossible configurations, buildings becoming living things that hungered for occupants, populations transformed into creatures existing partially in real space and partially in the warp, entire septs where the greater good twisted into religious fervor that fed entities in the Immaterium, creating feedback loops that consumed rational thought. The visions lasted 30 seconds before the entity withdrew, but the damage was done. Vash never regained consciousness, his body continuing to breathe, but his mind simply gone. 4 other trainees died within hours despite intensive intervention, their brains showing damage without evidence of bleeding. The remaining 7 survived but were permanently altered, their psychic sensitivity amplified to levels that made normal life impossible. They perceived the warp constantly now, unable to filter out the immaterial dimension pressing against reality everywhere. One described existence as living inside a building with transparent walls, while horrors pressed faces against the glass. She could see daemons everywhere in the spaces between, watching and waiting for opportunities to breach into real space. Another developed probability, perception. seeing potential futures branch from every decision until the present moment became lost in a forest of possibilities. He eventually requested euthanasia rather than continue existing where he could never be certain which timeline was real. The Viola incident forced complete reassessment. The Ethereal Council convened with Anva demanding answers experts couldn't provide. How had one meditation session resulted in catastrophic failure when the same protocols had succeeded before? Could similar incidents occur at other facilities? Koror Talka's researchers offered theories but no certainties, explaining they were attempting to develop safe psychic practices for a species with no evolutionary preparation for touching the warp. Every protocol was experimental, based on incomplete understanding of phenomena, defying comprehensive analysis. Leonara, a former Sister of Battle serving as human advisor, delivered an assessment many found deeply uncomfortable. She told them they were approaching psychic development with the same confidence they brought to engineering challenges, assuming sufficient research would yield safe, controllable results. This assumption was wrong in ways they couldn't appreciate because they lacked the Imperium's experience. The warp wasn't a force to be harnessed, but an ocean full of predators. Psykers swam in that ocean every time they used abilities. The Imperium had learned through 10,000 years that some predators were patient, presenting themselves as allies before revealing true nature. Daemonic corruption crept in through subtle compromise, offering power for small prices until victims were too deep to escape. The Tau were trying to develop Psykers without fear, through education rather than trauma, and Leonara believed that approach would fail catastrophically when the warp finally decided to test it seriously. The containment facility holding the alpha subjects began detecting presences around its structure, entities in the Immaterium drawn by the unusual nature of transforming Tau. Most seemed merely curious, brief attention from warp denizens that perceived the subjects as novelties before moving on. Others showed sustained interest, returning repeatedly to examine the Tau Psykers like one might observe a fascinating experiment. The staff, working with Eldari advisors experienced in identifying immaterial entities, began classifying these observers. Some seemed genuinely neutral, things existing in the warp without predatory intent. Others demonstrated clear malevolence, pressing against defenses and testing for weaknesses. Most disturbing were observers that defied classification, entities shifting between benevolence and hostility, or whose motivations were so alien that concepts of good and evil simply didn't apply. Among these observers, one stood out as particularly persistent. The monitoring systems designated it Contact Sigma, a presence returning daily despite comprehensive wards. Sigma manifested differently to each observer. Terran perceived it as geometric impossibility, shapes folding through dimensions physics said couldn't exist. Sael saw it as absence, a void in realities underneath that was somehow conscious. Shais felt it as thought without thinker, intelligence expressing itself without being anchored to any entity. The Eldari recognized Sigma's patterns as consistent with greater daemons, entities of immense power serving chaos gods directly. What made Sigma alarming was its behavior. Unlike most warp entities showing aggression or temptation, Sigma simply watched and occasionally communicated, conveying concepts directly into consciousness. It claimed interest in the Tau not as prey or tools but as potential peers. It implied that the Tau's psychic awakening represented something significant in the Immaterium's ecosystem, the emergence of a species whose unique relationship with the warp offered possibilities even chaos gods found novel. Sigma's communications suggested that the Tau's minimal warp presence had been noticed by powers moving in the Immaterium's deepest currents. For millennia, the Tau had existed beneath the notice of greater entities, too dim to warrant attention. But recent mutations and psychic awakening created ripples, echoing into regions where time and space held even less meaning, drawing attention from things that observed reality itself like humans watching bacterial cultures evolve. These entities saw the Tau as an experiment worth monitoring, a species developing abilities through unprecedented circumstances that might produce results different from standard patterns of ascension, corruption, and consumption. Sigma conveyed that the Tau had become subjects in observations conducted by entities so vast their interest alone could warp probability. This attention carried no inherent hostility but wasn't benevolent either. The Tau were simply interesting, and that interest made them visible to every predator and opportunist hunting in spaces between stars. Before the Ethereal Council could decide how to respond to such attention, events forced their hand. A young Tau Psyker in training at a Dalith facility named Orin suffered catastrophic corruption, resulting in the first confirmed demonic possession in Tau history. Orin had been progressing well, showing moderate abilities and good psychological resilience. During routine meditation, he suddenly convulsed while vocalizing sounds the equipment recorded but human language couldn't reproduce. His eyes cycled through color shifts biological optics shouldn't produce. Then he spoke in perfect Gothic, the Imperium's tongue he'd never been taught. The entity speaking through Orin identified itself as Herald of the Changer of Ways, declared that Tau attempts to develop abilities without understanding the warp's nature were amusing to certain powers, and stated Orin was now claimed as tithe and trophy. The possession lasted 47 seconds before Orin's body combusted, burning with fire, producing no heat and leaving no ash. When the conflagration ended, Orin was simply gone, vanished completely. In his place lay a symbol burned into metal that shouldn't burn, an 8-pointed star that humans recognized immediately as the mark of Chaos Undivided. Orin's possession shattered remaining illusions that the Tau could develop abilities without risking catastrophes that marked humanity's relationship with the warp. The entity claimed Orin casually, effortlessly, despite every safeguard. The message was clear. The Tau were noticed now, and certain powers found their ignorance entertaining enough to exploit. The incident triggered crises across multiple fronts. Facilities shut down, staff interrogated for corruption. The Ethereal Council activated contingency protocols, including evacuation plans for entire sept worlds if demonic incursion proved uncontainable. For the first time in history, the Tau began seriously considering whether survival might require adopting belief systems they'd always dismissed as primitive superstition. If the warp responded to faith as much as conscious manipulation, perhaps they needed something equivalent to the Imperium's Emperor worship, conceptual frameworks providing psychic protection through collective belief rather than individual power. The debate about developing religious practices generated the most intense philosophical conflict in the Empire's history. The proposal represented everything the Tau had defined themselves against: irrationality, faith without evidence, belief prioritizing comfort over truth. They'd built civilization on science and reason precisely because they rejected the superstition keeping other species trapped in ignorance. Adopting religious practices felt like admitting defeat, accepting that humanity's faith-based approach was correct after all. But practical considerations were undeniable. The Imperium survived 10,000 years with the warp constantly trying to destroy it, their survival resting on faith in the Emperor providing protection science couldn't explain. The Aeldari maintained craft-world civilization despite birthing Slaanesh because their mythology provided frameworks making them resistant to further corruption. Even orcs possessed instinctive beliefs, shaping reality through collective will that protected them from many forms of demonic predation. Every psychically active species that survived did so partly through belief systems empiricism couldn't justify, but that worked because the warp made belief itself a form of power. Anvar provided the perspective that ultimately shaped the Empire's response. He reminded the Ethereals that the greater good itself functioned as a belief system, a philosophical framework providing meaning and direction. The difference was that the Tau had always presented it as rational conclusion rather than article of faith, logical principle rather than religious devotion. But perhaps that distinction was less fundamental than assumed. What if the greater good could serve the same psychic protective function that the Imperium's faith provided? Not by abandoning rationality, but by recognizing that deeply held philosophical commitments influenced the warp regardless of whether labeled as faith or reason? The Tau already united thoughts around central concepts. What if they could formalize and strengthen that unity into something approaching collective psychic shields that other species developed through religion? It wouldn't require embracing superstition, merely acknowledging that the warp responded to conviction and collective belief regardless of intellectual framework. The greater good could become simultaneously rational philosophy and psychic defense, serving dual functions, allowing the Tao to protect themselves without betraying fundamental nature. Implementation began immediately despite philosophical objections. Meditation practices were modified to include visualization of the greater good as tangible presence, encouraging Tao to feel connection rather than merely accepting it intellectually. Educational curricula emphasized the philosophy's central importance as emotional touchstone rather than just political principle. The ethereals began actively projecting psychic presence during public addresses, using natural abilities to reinforce unity and shared purpose. The entire empire was being retooled to function as a machine producing psychic coherence, transforming billions of individual Tao into collective consciousness that might register in the warp as something too unified for chaos to easily corrupt. The effects became measurable within months. The Tao population's collective psychic signature, previously dim and fragmentary, began showing increased coherence and intensity. Individual flames remained small, but were beginning to resonate in patterns, suggesting synchronization. The greater good was becoming visible in the warp not as specific entity but as structure, framework organizing two psychic presence into something resembling architecture. Aeldari observers described watching a constellation of dim stars slowly organizing into coherent patterns, individual lights remaining faint, but collective arrangement creating something greater than simple addition suggested. Even the Nikasa, whose psychic traditions predated the Tao's, acknowledged what the Empire was attempting, represented something genuinely novel. But success brought new dangers planners hadn't anticipated. As the greater good became psychically visible, it attracted attention from entities that hadn't previously considered the Tao worthy of notice. Most concerning were indications that certain warp entities were attempting to infiltrate or corrupt the philosophy's psychic architecture from within, introducing distortions that might twist it into something serving their purposes. The research staff documented instances of subtle corruption, attempting to transform unity into conformity, cooperation into subjugation, the greater good into tool for controlling rather than coordinating. These corruptions were insidious because they mimicked the genuine philosophy so closely, shifting emphasis rather than replacing concepts, making oppression feel like collective good and manipulation feel like guidance. The Tao were learning that their attempt to weaponize the greater good as defense had made it into target, something hostile entities might capture and corrupt to serve purposes antithetical to everything the philosophy originally meant. The three alpha subjects continued changing in ways that defied understanding. Terran began speaking languages no Tao had heard, ancient tongues linguistic analysis couldn't identify, but that carried meaning despite incomprehensibility. Her physical form exhibited inconsistencies defying medical explanation. She would measure one height in morning and different height by evening despite no growth being physically possible. Her reflection in mirrors sometimes showed different individuals, faces resembling her but shifted in ways, suggesting she was becoming multiple possible versions simultaneously. She explained that she could feel herself spreading across probability streams, her identity fragmenting into countless alternate versions, experiencing different potential realities. When she designed new technologies, she drew knowledge from versions of herself existing in timelines where the Tao had made different choices. She was becoming distributed consciousness existing across the multiverse, and the version speaking in material universe was just one instance of something larger transcending conventional identity. Sale's perception of realities underneath was expanding, allowing her to see further into the Immaterium structure. She reported entities in that realm becoming aware of her observation. Her telepathic range increased without conscious effort, picking up thoughts from Tau kilometers away despite all training emphasizing control and limitation. Shais found her abilities growing beyond intended parameters, her consciousness extending into dimensions that baseline creatures never perceived. The Nikasa had warned this would happen, explaining that psychic ability wasn't simply a skill but fundamental alteration of how one existed in the universe. Psykers didn't just touch the warp, They lived partially in the Immaterium always. The strongest became hybrid entities, part material and part immaterial, and the more they developed abilities, the more they transformed into something that wasn't quite mortal anymore. The Ethereal Council faced unprecedented decision. What to do with citizens transitioning into something that might no longer be Tau in any meaningful sense? All three remained rational, cooperative, committed to the greater good as they understood it, but they were clearly becoming something existing beyond normal parameters. They couldn't be contained, as Terran demonstrated by appearing simultaneously in multiple locations when supposedly secured. They couldn't be cured, as no intervention could reverse transformation operating at metaphysical levels. And they couldn't simply be allowed to continue developing unchecked, because nobody understood what they might become or what dangers that posed. The Ethereals did something unprecedented. They asked the Alpha subjects themselves what should be done. Sael spoke first, voice carrying harmonics, suggesting multiple timelines speaking simultaneously. She didn't want to die but understood the danger she represented. She could feel entities in the Immaterium pressing against her consciousness, offering power and knowledge in exchange for access to real space. She didn't know how much longer she could refuse them, not because they were tempting, but because they were infinitely patient, willing to wait until exhaustion or curiosity or simple loneliness made her vulnerable. If the Ethereals believed terminating her would protect the Empire, she would accept that decision as final service to the greater good. But she asked that her death at least provide useful data, that researchers document her termination so future Psykers might learn from her failure. Terran's response was more complex. She said termination might not be possible anymore, not in any way that would be permanent. She existed across too many probability streams, and destroying one instance wouldn't eliminate others. She could feel versions of herself that had already died in other timelines, continuing to exist as probability rather than actuality. Killing her body would dissolve her current material anchor, but the distributed consciousness she'd become would persist in forms the Tau couldn't destroy because they operated on metaphysical levels beyond material intervention. This wasn't boasting or resistance, simply technical assessment. She had become something existing partially outside causality, and normal destruction methods assumed causal relationships that no longer strictly applied. Terran's assessment terrified the Ethereals because it suggested they'd created an entity they couldn't control, contain, or eliminate if necessary. Shai's provided the most unsettling perspective because hers combined pragmatism with resignation. She told the Ethereals she could read their thoughts, and knew they were considering terminating all three, regardless of what subjects requested. She perceived fear and calculation behind careful diplomacy, the way they weighed moral principles against necessity and found principles wanting. She didn't blame them. Fear was appropriate response to uncontrolled transformation. But she wanted them to understand that killing the Alphas wouldn't solve the fundamental problem. The mutations spreading through the Tau genome weren't going to stop. More Psykers would manifest regardless. Eventually, the Empire would produce another Terran touching probability, another Sael perceiving reality's infrastructure, another Shais whose telepathy dissolved boundaries between minds. The Tau couldn't prevent their psychic awakening any more than they could prevent evolution. They could only choose whether to develop alongside changing nature or resist transformation until it overwhelmed them through inevitability. Shais advised acceptance, arguing that the Tau needed to embrace emerging psychic potential rather than treating it as disease. This required reconceptualizing the greater good to accommodate beings existing partially beyond material reality. The Ethereal Council deliberated for 3 days and reached a compromise accepting transformation as inevitable while attempting to manage rather than eliminate it. The Alpha subjects would not be terminated but isolated in a specially constructed facility designed to contain entities existing partially outside normal space-time. They would remain under constant monitoring, their transformations studied in detail so the Empire could learn how to prevent, guide, or at minimum anticipate similar developments. They would become living research subjects, their freedoms sacrificed but lives preserved, contributing to the greater good through continued existence, even if they could no longer participate in normal society. The facility constructed to house the Alpha subjects represented the Tau Empire's most ambitious attempt to create infrastructure bridging material and immaterial reality. Built on a moon orbiting Tau itself, the installation incorporated technologies adapted from captured Imperial equipment, Aeldari Wraithbone techniques, and purely Tau innovations. The structure existed simultaneously in real space and partially in the Immaterium, using principles Earth-caste engineers barely understood. The entire installation had one purpose: learn from the subject's transformation so the Empire could survive its own psychic awakening. The research produced insights revolutionizing Tau understanding, while raising questions challenging their civilization's philosophical foundations. Observations of Terran's distributed consciousness suggested individual identity might be less fundamental than assumed. Sale's perception of realities underneath provided first comprehensive maps of how the Immaterium intersected material space, revealing that solid reality was actually fragile boundary sustained by collective consensus. Scheiss's expanding telepathy demonstrated that minds weren't truly separate but existed in constant unconscious communication through the warp, individual thoughts emerging from collective psychic field like waves from ocean. These discoveries implied that the Tau's sense of self as discrete, autonomous individuals was partially illusory, that they'd always been more connected to each other and the warp than realized. But the most significant discovery came not from studying what the subjects were becoming, but from observing what was observing them. The facility's monitoring systems detected presences drawn by the unusual nature of transforming Tau. The staff began classifying these entities, building comprehensive databases. Among observers, one stood out. Contact Sigma, the persistent presence that had claimed interest in the Tau as potential peers. And Sigma wasn't alone. The monitoring equipment detected something that chilled every researcher who understood its implications. Massive entities were gathering at the edges of Tau space, drawn by the Empire's psychic awakening like predators scenting blood in water. Not dozens, not hundreds. Thousands of warp entities, ranging from lesser demons to things so vast that their true forms couldn't be perceived directly without inducing madness. They watched and waited with patience that measured time in eons rather than years. The war for the Tau Empire's soul was no longer metaphorical. It was a literal conflict being waged in the Immaterium, with the greater good itself as the prize both sides sought to claim. The Tau, with barely a generation of experience understanding psychic phenomena, were fighting that war against entities that had been manipulating belief and corrupting civilizations since before humanity crawled from Earth's oceans. Across the Empire, more Tau began manifesting abilities. The screening programs identified thousands, showing psychic potential, and the numbers grew with each passing cycle. The mutations were accelerating, spreading through the population faster than models predicted. Some manifested abilities spontaneously, without training or preparation, and the results were often catastrophic. A young aircraft pilot perceived all possible flight paths simultaneously during combat and flew her craft into a moon because she couldn't distinguish actual trajectory from probability. An Earth-caste researcher touched a bold prototype engine and saw its entire operational history across multiple timelines, his mind burning out from information overload. A water-caste negotiator read so deeply into a human merchant's thoughts that she experienced his entire life in seconds and forgot who she was for 3 days afterward. The casualty rate among manifesting Psykers remained unacceptably high. Nearly 40% either died during emergence or suffered permanent psychological damage. By Imperial standards, this represented remarkable success. The Imperium's sanctioning procedures killed far more candidates. But the Tau had built civilization on principles valuing every life, seeking solutions maximizing collective well-being rather than accepting sacrifice as necessary cost. The mounting casualties weighed heavily on ethereals responsible for continuing a program that consumed citizens in ways no war ever had. Then came the incident that changed everything. A containment facility on Sasea Sept reported unusual readings from a training session involving 6 Tau Psykers practicing defensive techniques. The subjects were experienced, all having completed basic training and showing good control over their abilities. They were working on collective shielding, attempting to pool their psychic strength to create barriers against warp intrusion. The theory was sound, adapted from Eldari techniques and modified for Tau physiology. For 17 minutes, the exercise proceeded normally. Monitors showed expected neural patterns. Psychic sensors detected the formation of rudimentary shields. Then, without warning, every alarm in the facility activated simultaneously. The shields the Psykers had been creating inverted. Instead of barriers keeping the warp out, they became channels pulling the Immaterium in. Reality tore open in the center of the training chamber, a wound in space-time through which something else bled into material universe. The breach was small, barely 3 meters across, but what came through defied description in terms that rational minds could process. The security footage captured by the facility's cameras showed geometry that hurt to view directly, colors that shouldn't exist, and movement that seemed to occur in multiple directions, including some that weren't spatial dimensions at all. The entities emerging from the breach were daemons, though the Tau had no word for them yet, and classified them in reports as hostile immaterial manifestations. The facility's automated defenses activated with efficiency that saved countless lives. Blast doors sealed the training chamber. Force fields designed to disrupt psychic phenomena activated at maximum power. Fire suppression systems flooded the sealed chamber with compounds that human advisors had insisted be stockpiled, despite Tau skepticism about their effectiveness. The automated protocols bought time, but they couldn't close the breach. For 43 minutes, reality remained torn in that chamber. While the entities that had crossed over tested the barriers containing them, they didn't attack the force fields directly. Instead, they did something far worse. They began changing the Tau Psykers who had accidentally summoned them. The 6 Psykers trapped in that chamber with the demons underwent transformation that the monitoring equipment captured in excruciating detail. Their bodies remained physically intact, but something fundamental about their nature changed at levels the sensors struggled to measure. They began moving in ways that violated biomechanics, their joints bending in directions anatomy didn't allow. Their faces shifted, features rearranging into configurations that resembled masks more than living tissue. When they spoke, their voices layered over each other, producing harmonics that caused auditory hallucinations in anyone who heard the recordings. They said things that made no sense in Tau language but that carried meaning anyway, concepts forcing themselves into minds without requiring comprehension. The daemons were puppeting them, using their bodies as anchors to maintain presence in real space, even if the breach could be closed. The Firecast response team that finally breached the sealed chamber found a scene that would haunt everyone who witnessed it. The 6 Psykers stood in a circle around the breach, which had shrunk to barely a meter but remained stubbornly open. They moved in perfect synchronization, 6 bodies controlled by unified will that clearly wasn't their own. When the fire warriors entered with weapons ready, the possessed Psykers turned as one and smiled. The expression was identical on all 6 faces, precise coordination impossible for separate individuals, unless something else was controlling them. Then they spoke, and every being in that room heard the words in their native language despite the Psykers' mouths forming syllables that matched none. The tower seen now. The games begin. We claim these 6 as opening wager. The Firecast commander made a decision that would be debated in military academies for generations. She ordered her team to open fire. Pulse rifles discharged at point-blank range, coherent plasma burning through flesh and bone with efficiency that defined Tau weaponry. The possessed Psykers fell, their bodies destroyed so completely that physical restoration was impossible. But in the moment before death, something happened that the monitoring equipment captured even though organic perception missed it. The daemons wearing the Psykers' forms laughed, a sound existing at frequencies beyond auditory range, and promised that the Tau had made death into doorway. 6 souls had just been claimed by entities that fed on such prizes, and the demons conveyed absolute certainty that those souls would never rest, would never be reborn, would exist forever as playthings in a realm where time meant nothing and torment could last eternally. The breach closed 17 seconds after the possessed Psykers died. Reality sealed itself with a sound like tearing fabric, and suddenly the training chamber was just a room again, walls scorched and floor covered in blood but otherwise mundane. The fire warriors stood in shocked silence, processing what they'd just done. They had killed 6 of their own, Tau citizens who had been training to serve the greater good, because something had taken them so completely that death was the only mercy available. The commander filed her report with clinical precision, documenting every decision and explaining the tactical necessity of her actions. But in private communications that were later leaked, she admitted something that sent shockwaves through fire-cased command. She didn't know if she'd made the right choice. Perhaps the possessed Psykers could have been saved. Perhaps killing them had been exactly what the daemons wanted. Sacrifices that fed entities existing beyond material harm. The uncertainty was poison. For military doctrine built on clear orders and decisive action, the Sasaya breach forced the Ethereal Council to confront a reality they had been avoiding. The Tau Empire might not survive its psychic awakening. Every attempt to control or manage psychic development introduced new vulnerabilities. Training produced casualties. Suppression proved impossible with mutations spreading exponentially. Defensive measures like weaponizing the greater good attracted exactly the attention they were meant to deflect. The Empire was trapped in a spiral where every action to improve their situation made it worse, and inaction guaranteed catastrophic manifestations like the Sarsia incident. They were fighting a war on terrain they didn't understand against enemies they couldn't perceive until those enemies decided to make themselves known, and they were losing. Anva convened what would become known as the Council of Final Truths, gathering not just ethereals but representatives from every caste, every sept, and every major auxiliary species integrated into the Empire. Humans who had fled the Imperium's brutality, Eldari corsairs who had offered their expertise, Nikasa Psykers whose traditions predated the Tau's civilization, Kroot shapers whose evolution allowed them to perceive things Tau eyes missed. Even a single Jokero, whose strange genius with technology might offer insights no other species could provide. The assembly represented something unprecedented. The Tau, admitting they needed help from species they had always viewed as less advanced or enlightened. Pride gave way to pragmatism born of desperation. For 3 days, the Council of Final Truths debated the fundamental question. Could the Tau survive as Tau while embracing psychic development, or would they need to transform into something else entirely? The human representatives argued that survival required accepting unpleasant realities about the warp's nature. It wasn't a frontier to be explored, or a resource to be harvested, but an active threat requiring eternal vigilance. The Imperium survived not because they mastered the warp, but because they acknowledged they never would, implementing brutal measures that prioritized collective survival over individual well-being. The Tau would need to make similar choices, establishing systems for identifying and eliminating threats, even when those threats wore familiar faces. Some Psykers would need to die not because they had done anything wrong, but because they represented unacceptable risks. Some knowledge would need to be suppressed, not because it was false, but because understanding it exposed citizens to corruption. The Tau would need to choose between their principles and their survival, and the humans who had fled the Imperium's darkness could testify that survival always won that argument eventually. The Eldari offered different perspective rooted in their own civilization's catastrophic fall. They explained that the Tau's current trajectory mirrored the path the Eldari had walked before the fall, when their empire had believed itself sophisticated enough to explore every excess without consequence. The birth of Slanesh proved that assumption fatal. The Eldari survived not by mastering their relationship with the warp, but by completely restructuring their civilization around avoiding the mistakes that had destroyed their empire. The craft worlds existed as fortresses of discipline, every aspect of life controlled to prevent the emotional extremes that fed chaos. If the Tau wanted to survive their psychic awakening, they would need similar restructuring, transforming the greater good from philosophical framework into absolute law, enforced with the kind of authoritarian control they had always claimed to reject. Freedom would need to become carefully managed illusion, choice constrained to options that didn't risk corruption, individuality subordinated completely to collective safety. The Aeldari's message was blunt. The Tau could survive, but they would need to sacrifice everything that made them Tau in the process. The Nikasa provided the most unsettling assessment because it came from species that had successfully integrated psychic abilities into stable civilization without catastrophic corruption. They explained that their success relied on fundamental principles the Tau couldn't replicate. Nikasa psychic traditions were communal, distributing psychic burden across entire populations, so no individual carried enough power to become vector for demonic intrusion. Their society had evolved over millions of years to incorporate psychic perception as baseline rather than exceptional ability, developing instincts and cultural practices that protected them through collective wisdom rather than individual discipline. Most importantly, the Nikasa had accepted that being psychically active meant existing partially in the warp always, living with constant awareness of that realm's presence and dangers. They didn't try to use psychic abilities as tools while maintaining mental separation from the Immaterium. They embraced their dual nature as beings inhabiting both realms simultaneously. The Tau were attempting something far more difficult, developing psychic capabilities while remaining fundamentally materialist, treating the warp as phenomenon to be studied while denying its metaphysical implications. The Nikasa believed this approach was doomed because it required the Tau to simultaneously acknowledge and deny reality, creating cognitive dissonance that left them vulnerable to corruption through the cracks in their worldview. The debate might have continued indefinitely if Terran, monitoring the proceedings from her containment facility through psychic perception none of the wards could block, hadn't interrupted with communication that bypassed conventional channels entirely. Every individual in the council chamber simultaneously received the same message, not as words but as knowing impressed directly onto consciousness. Terran showed them what she perceived from her position existing partially outside normal causality. She revealed the Tau Empire as it appeared from perspectives touching multiple timelines simultaneously. In some futures, the Tau embraced psychic development and transformed into something magnificent, a civilization whose unique balance of reason and warp touch made them valuable allies to the Aeldari and terrifying opponents to chaos. In others, they suppressed psychic awakening through increasingly authoritarian measures, until they became indistinguishable from the Imperium they despised, surviving but losing everything that made survival worthwhile. In still others, they attempted compromise and were destroyed utterly, their empire consumed by demonic incursion or chaos corruption that turned the greater good into feeding mechanism for dark gods. Terran showed them thousands of possible futures branching from every decision point, and the message was clear. There was no safe path forward, no choice that guaranteed survival without sacrifice, no way to remain unchanged while the galaxy changed around them. But Terran offered something beyond mere warning. She showed them a possibility that existed in only a handful of probability streams, a narrow path requiring precision and sacrifice but offering something unprecedented. What if the Tau's weakness was actually their strength? Their minimal psychic presence had always made them dim in the warp, barely visible to entities that fed on psychic emanations. What if instead of trying to become brighter, more psychically powerful, and therefore more vulnerable, they leaned into that dimness? What if they developed techniques for deliberately suppressing psychic presence, becoming not just invisible but actively repellent to warp entities? It would require the opposite approach from every other psychically active species, cultivating absence rather than power, learning to exist as voids in the Immaterium that daemons couldn't perceive or couldn't be bothered to investigate. The Tau would remain psychically aware, able to perceive and defend against warp-based threats, but they would do so by mastering the art of psychic stealth rather than psychic might. They would become the galaxy's first civilization of psychic ghosts, present but undetectable, aware but untouchable. The concept was revolutionary and deeply aligned with Tau philosophy in unexpected ways. The Kroot practiced similar principles in physical space, using camouflage and guerrilla tactics rather than direct confrontation. The Tau's own military doctrine emphasized combined arms and tactical flexibility over brute force. Why should their psychic development follow different principles? Anvar seized on Tehran's vision, recognizing it as potential synthesis of competing approaches that had deadlocked the Council. The Tau would pursue psychic development, but focus on defensive applications and concealment rather than offensive power. They would train Psykers not to manifest impressive abilities but to minimize their warp presence while maintaining awareness. They would weaponize their natural dimness, turning evolutionary weakness into strategic advantage. It was characteristically Tau, taking what others would view as limitation and transforming it through ingenuity into unprecedented capability. Implementation of what became known as the Path of Shadows required complete restructuring of the psychic development program. Koror Talkar's training protocols were redesigned from ground up, discarding techniques adapted from humans and Eldari in favor of approaches developed specifically for Tau physiology and psychology. Instead of teaching Psykers to channel warp energy for spectacular effects, trainers focused on helping them perceive the Immaterium while remaining imperceptible to entities inhabiting it. The meditation techniques emphasized emptiness rather than focus, teaching Psykers to become psychic voids that thought and emotion couldn't fill. Combat applications focused on negation and disruption rather than direct attack, using abilities like Sales nullification to erase enemy advantages rather than creating Tau superiority. Telepaths like Shais learned to read thoughts without projecting their own presence, becoming invisible observers rather than active participants in psychic communication. The results were dramatic and encouraging. Tau Psykers following the Path of Shadows showed significantly lower corruption rates than previous training cohorts. Their abilities were less impressive by conventional standards, but more reliable and controllable. Most importantly, they attracted less attention from warp entities. The monitoring systems at research facilities detected far fewer demonic observations of Psykers trained in stealth techniques compared to those taught conventional power projection. The Tau were discovering something that no other species had pursued. It was possible to be psychically active without being psychically loud, to touch the warp without drawing every predator in the Immaterium to your location. They were becoming what Terran had envisioned, ghosts in a realm where most beings blazed like bonfires. But the Path of Shadows came with its own costs and complications. Psykers trained in suppression techniques reported feeling profoundly isolated, their awareness of the Immaterium making them conscious of dimensions their fellow Tau couldn't perceive, while their training prevented them from connecting with other psychically active beings. They existed in a liminal state, neither fully part of material reality nor truly touching the warp, and the psychological toll was severe. Depression rates among Shadow Path Psykers exceeded even the Imperial-sanctioned Psyker programs known for producing damaged but functional individuals. Some trainees couldn't master the suppression techniques and had to be removed from the program. Others mastered them too well and couldn't shut them off, becoming so psychically invisible that even other Tau struggled to remember they were present. The most disturbing complication emerged when researchers realized that Psykers following the Path of Shadows were being noticed by different types of entities than those drawn to conventional Psykers. Where normal psychic activity attracted chaos daemons and warp predators, the Shadow Path Psykers caught the attention of something else, beings that the Eldari consultants identified with visible fear as servants of the Deceiver. These entities, fragments or heralds of one of the ancient Khand, were drawn to the Tau's attempts at psychic concealment, the way sharks were drawn to wounded prey trying to hide. The Deceiver's servants valued stealth and manipulation, and they perceived the Tau's Path of Shadows as potential tool or threat depending on how it developed. Several Shadow Path Psykers reported dreams of crystalline intelligence offering to teach them perfect concealment, absolute invisibility in the warp, in exchange for small favors that seemed innocuous, until human advisors who had dealt with the Necrons explained exactly how dangerous such bargains would be. The Tau had solved one problem by creating another, trading Daemonic attention for something potentially worse. Despite complications, the Path of Shadows represented genuine progress in ways the early psychic development program never achieved. The Tau were learning to exist as psychically active species without constantly risking catastrophic corruption. Casualties among trainees dropped to acceptable levels. Facilities reported fewer breach attempts and less Daemonic observation. The Empire began integrating Shadow Path Psykers into military and civilian roles, where their abilities provided tangible benefits without the constant terror that characterized early deployment. A new generation of Tau was emerging, individuals who could perceive threats in the Immaterium and defend against them while remaining largely invisible to the very entities they monitored. It wasn't the glorious psychic ascension some had envisioned, but it was survival, and survival was increasingly valuable commodity in a galaxy where every other option seemed to lead toward extinction or corruption. The three Alpha subjects watched these developments from their containment facility with mixed emotions. Sail felt vindication that her nullification abilities, initially viewed as aberrant, had become template for an entire approach to psychic development. Shays appreciated that her struggles with isolation were finally being acknowledged and addressed in training protocols for younger Psykers. But Terran, whose distributed consciousness perceived probabilities across multiple timelines, saw something that troubled her deeply. In the probability streams where the Tau successfully implemented the path of shadows and survived their psychic awakening, they weren't quite Tau anymore by the end. The suppression techniques, the constant vigilance against corruption, the psychological isolation of existing between realms transformed them into something harder, colder, more alien than the optimistic civilization that had first encountered the warp's reality. They survived, but survival cost them the idealism and unity that had made them worth saving. Terran kept this observation to herself, uncertain whether sharing it would help or harm, whether forewarning of slow transformation would allow the T-Tau to prevent it or merely demoralize them before the battle was fully joined. 50 years after Monot first encountered the impossible rotating figurine, the Tau Empire had transformed in ways that would have been unrecognizable to the civilization that began the journey. Psychic development was now mandatory for all Tau, with screening programs identifying potential, from birth and training beginning in childhood. The Path of Shadows had become not just a technique but a philosophy, a way of existing that permeated every aspect of Tau culture. Citizens learned to suppress their emotional responses, to think in ways that minimized psychic presence, to live lives of quiet discipline that would have seemed oppressive to their ancestors, but that protected them from predation in a galaxy where thought itself could attract doom. The greater good remained central to their identity, but it had been weaponized, formalized, transformed from aspirational philosophy into rigid doctrine that brooked no deviation. The ethereal caste had grown more powerful and more isolated, their natural psychic abilities now openly acknowledged and utilized to maintain unity in population that might otherwise fragment under the strain of constant vigilance. Anvar had finally passed, his ancient form giving out after witnessing changes he had never imagined possible, and his successors ruled with authority that bordered on the absolute. The Fire Caste had integrated Shadow Path Psykers into every combat unit, warriors who could perceive enemy movements through the warp and disrupt hostile psychic abilities before they manifested. The Earth Caste had developed technologies marrying material science with psychic principles, devices that shouldn't work according to conventional physics, but that functioned anyway through applications of will disciplined by the Path of Shadows. The Water Caste had mastered psychic diplomacy, reading alien minds while projecting carefully crafted false impressions that made negotiations more prediction than discussion. The Air Caste could navigate warp-adjacent spaces with safety humans achieved only through navigators, using their psychic stealth to avoid notice from entities that made travel through the Immaterium normally catastrophic. But the cost of these achievements was visible everywhere for those with eyes to see. The Tau no longer laughed freely or expressed joy without reservation. Every emotion was measured, every thought disciplined, every impulse suppressed, because allowing feelings to flow unchecked risked creating ripples in the warp that might attract attention. The young were raised in facilities that resembled the Imperium's Schola Progenium more than the communal learning centers that had characterized Tau education for millennia. Dissenters disappeared not into prisons but into psychic conditioning programs that returned them as hollow shells, obedient and functional but lacking the spark that made individuals more than biological automatons. The Empire had survived its psychic awakening, but in doing so had sacrificed much of what made survival meaningful. They had become what Leonara, the former sister of battle, had once warned they might need to become. A civilization that valued order over freedom, security over growth, survival over everything else that made life worth living. Monat, the engineer who had first encountered the impossible, lived still, now ancient by Tau standards and serving as historical advisor to Kor Talka. She spent her days documenting the transformation she had witnessed, compiling records so future generations would understand how the Tau had reached this point. In her private writings, never meant for official archives, she confessed doubts that ate at her like acid. She wondered whether warning the ethereals about the rotating figurine had been right choice. Perhaps if she had simply destroyed the object without reporting it, thrown it into a plasma furnace and pretended it never existed, the Tau might have remained blind to the warp for another generation or two. Perhaps that would have been mercy, allowing them more decades of innocence before reality forced terrible knowledge upon them. Or perhaps the awakening was inevitable regardless of her actions, written into their genetics by forces or intelligences, operating on timescales that made individual choices irrelevant. She would never know, and the uncertainty was its own special torment. The 3 Alpha subjects remained in their containment facility, now less prisoners than prophets, beings who had transformed so completely that they existed more in the warp than in real space. Sale perceived all of Tau space simultaneously, her consciousness spread across realities underneath like vast sensory network. She reported what she saw to researchers who struggled to comprehend her descriptions. The Tau Empire appeared in her perception as a constellation of carefully dimmed lights, stars deliberately suppressing their own radiance to avoid attracting moths that fed on brightness. It was working in the sense that demonic attention had decreased dramatically. But other things were noticing, entities that valued stealth and subtlety, forces that saw the Tau's path of shadows as either template to emulate or threat to eliminate. Sael couldn't tell which, and her inability to distinguish between these possibilities was itself form of torment. Terran had transcended physical form entirely, existing now as pure probability distributed across infinite timelines. The containment facility maintained a representation of her, a quantum construct that appeared as young Earth-cased engineer but was actually just the most stable collapsed waveform of something far vaster. She communicated rarely, and when she did, her messages came as visions experienced by multiple recipients simultaneously. Her last major communication, delivered to the Ethereal Council 3 years before the present moment, had shown them the endgame of the path of shadows in those probability streams where it succeeded completely. The Tau became invisible not just to the warp but to themselves, their psychic stealth so perfect that they lost ability to perceive each other's souls. They functioned as civilization mechanically, their technology and organization maintaining momentum, but the spiritual connection that had made the greater good more than political fiction vanished. They became a species of ghosts haunting their own empire, present but not truly alive in any way that mattered beyond biological persistence. Terran had asked the ethereals whether that future was preferable to the alternatives, and they had no answer that satisfied anyone, including themselves. Shais had achieved state that the Nikasa recognized as similar to their own greatest psychic masters. Her consciousness expanded to encompass vast swathes of psychic space, while remaining anchored to material form through techniques she had developed independently. She served as the facility's primary guardian, her telepathic abilities detecting any hostile psychic intrusion before it could threaten the research staff or the other Alpha subjects. But her expanded consciousness came with burden that no amount of discipline could completely alleviate. She felt every Tau in the Empire as distant presences in her awareness, billions of dim flames flickering with emotions and thoughts they tried desperately to suppress. The collective effort to maintain psychic stealth created its own kind of psychic noise, a constant susurrus of determined quietude that was somehow louder than open expression would have been. Shais existed in permanent state of overstimulation, processing more psychic input than any mind should handle. and only her commitment to the greater good kept her from simply letting go and dispersing into the warp entirely. She knew she would eventually make that choice. The question was when, and whether she would do so deliberately as final service or simply reach breaking point and collapse without warning. The galaxy beyond Tau space took note of their transformation, with reactions ranging from relief to concern to outright suspicion. The Imperium's Inquisition maintained extensive files on the Tau psychic development program, tracking its evolution with interest that bordered on obsession. Some Inquisitors argued the Tau had found genuinely novel approach to managing psychic populations and that the Imperium should study their methods for potential adaptation. Others insisted that the Tau's path of shadows represented heretical innovation that would inevitably lead to catastrophic failure, and that preemptive exterminatus was only rational response. The debate continued within inquisitorial circles, with no clear consensus emerging except agreement that the Tau now represented unknown quantity in ways they hadn't before their psychic awakening. They were no longer the naive materialists who could be dismissed as ignorant of reality's true nature. They had become something else, and the Imperium hadn't decided yet whether that something was potential ally against chaos or new form of threat requiring elimination. The Eldari observed with mixture of respect and melancholy. Ileana Ravenmoon, the Farseer who had first offered assistance to the Tau, reported to her Craftworld's council that the Tau had chosen path that might allow them to survive in the short term, but that seemed likely to consume them in the long run. The path of shadows required constant suppression of the very traits that made civilization vibrant and adaptive. The Tau were sacrificing their capacity for growth in exchange for stability, trading potential for security, and history suggested that species making such bargains eventually stagnated into irrelevance or collapsed when circumstances changed in ways their rigid structures couldn't accommodate. The Eldari had walked similar path after the fall, and while it had preserved them, it had also trapped them in eternal holding pattern where survival became the only goal and everything else secondary. Ileana wondered whether warning the Tau about this fate would help or simply hasten it by making them conscious of trap they were already in. The Chaos Gods regarded the Tau's transformation with various degrees of interest and irritation. Sencha found the entire development fascinating, the Tau's attempt to use change and adaptation to avoid corruption, representing recursive paradox that appealed to the changer of ways' sense of irony. Khorne cared little for beings who deliberately suppressed the very emotions that fueled his power, dismissing the Tau as beneath notice now that they had made themselves so quiet in the warp. Nurgle watched with patient attention, recognizing that the stress and discipline required to maintain the path of shadows would eventually produce forms of despair and stagnation that fed his nature. Slaanesh was perhaps most frustrated, finding the Tau's rigorous emotional suppression antithetical to everything the Prince of Pleasure represented, yet unable to break through their defenses precisely because those defenses were built on denying the very excess that was Slaanesh's power. The Tau had made themselves uninteresting to most chaos entities, which was exactly the point, but they had also attracted attention from the Chaos Gods themselves, who now monitored them as potential variable in the great game that might need addressing eventually. And in the spaces between stars, in the depths of the Immaterium where reality thinned to translucent membrane, Contact Sigma continued its observations of the Tau Empire with interest that never waned. The entity that had been watching since the first manifestations remained present, a vast intelligence whose motivations no mortal mind could fully comprehend. Sigma had witnessed the Tau's entire transformation, from blind materialists to psychically aware ghosts, and it had drawn conclusions that would have terrified the Tau if they knew what those conclusions were. The Tau had discovered something that other species had never seriously pursued: the possibility of being psychically active without being psychically present, of existing in two realms simultaneously while remaining invisible to both. This was neither ascension nor corruption but a third path, and Sigma recognized it as potentially significant development in the endless cycle of rise and fall that characterized galactic civilizations. Whether that significance would ultimately benefit or doom the Tau remained uncertain, but Sigma was patient. It had existed for eons before the Tau crawled from their planet, and it would exist for eons after they were gone. It could wait to see how this experiment concluded. The story of the Tau's psychic awakening had no neat ending because it wasn't over. 50 years had passed since Monat encountered the rotating figurine, but in the context of galactic history, 50 years was barely an eye blink. The Tau had survived their first contact with the warp, had adapted and developed methods that allowed them to persist as psychically active species without immediately being consumed by chaos. But the long-term consequences of the path of shadows remained unknown. Would the psychological costs eventually prove unsustainable, leading to societal collapse when the population could no longer bear the burden of constant suppression? Would their psychic stealth attract worse attention than open presence ever would have, drawing the notice of entities that valued subterfuge and deception? Would they slowly transform into something so different from their origins that the name Tau would become historical artifact with no connection to whatever they became? Or would they successfully navigate the dangers, emerging as the galaxy's first civilization to master psychic abilities without falling to corruption, proving that reason and discipline could triumph even in a universe that seemed designed to reward faith and excess? No one knew the answers, not the ethereals guiding the Empire, not the alpha subjects perceiving across timelines, not the chaos gods wagering on potential outcomes, not even Sigma with its vast intelligence and eternal patience. The Tau had entered genuinely uncharted territory, walking a path no other species had followed, and the destination remained shrouded in uncertainty that even precognition couldn't penetrate. They had paid terrible price to reach this point, sacrificing much of what made them unique in exchange for survival. Whether that price would prove worthwhile, whether survival bought at such cost was victory or simply slower form of defeat, remained the fundamental question haunting their civilization. And in a research facility on Dalith Sept, in a containment chamber that no longer held anything that needed containing because the object of concern had long since been destroyed, a young Earth-cased engineer whose name would never be recorded in history encountered another impossibility. A small figurine, clearly human in origin and depicting a winged infant, floated in the air where a containment field should have been but wasn't. The engineer reached out, and her hand passed through empty space while her eyes insisted the figurine remained. She pulled her hand back and watched frost form on her fingertips. That night, she would dream of wings covered in eyes that wept blood the color of starlight. In the morning, she would find a pattern carved into her forearm that she didn't remember making. A perfect circle bisected by 7 lines, pulsing with heat her scanner couldn't detect. The cycle was beginning again. The warp was patient, and it never stopped testing, never stopped probing for weaknesses, never stopped offering gifts that were really curses to those foolish enough to accept them. The Tau had learned to walk in shadows, but shadows were still darkness, and in darkness, horrors lurked that even the most disciplined vigilance couldn't completely avoid. They had survived their first encounter with the Immaterium's true nature. How many more encounters they could survive before either succumbing or transforming into something unrecognizable remained the question that would define their civilization's future. The greater good endured, but it endured in forms its founders would have struggled to recognize. And somewhere in the depths of the warp, something ancient and terrible smiled at the irony of a species that had achieved survival by sacrificing everything that made survival worthwhile. The Tau had discovered Psykers, and the discovery had changed them in ways that could never be undone, for better or worse, in futures that remained uncertain but were certainly different from anything they had imagined when they first looked at the stars and saw only wonders waiting to be understood rather than horrors waiting to be survived. The Tau thought they could master the warp through science and reason alone. They learned that survival required sacrifice they never anticipated. They became ghosts in their own empire, shadows walking between worlds, neither fully material nor truly touching the Immaterium. They survived their psychic awakening, but the civilization that emerged from that crucible was something their ancestors wouldn't recognize. The greater good endured, but it endured as chains as much as philosophy, discipline as much as unity. And in the darkness between stars, Entities far older than the Tau watched and waited, patient as only immortal things can be, knowing that every species that touches the warp eventually faces a reckoning. The Tau had postponed theirs. Whether they could avoid it forever remained the question that would haunt every generation to come. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. And now, the Tau finally understood why.